of the more notable people to work in these hotels was a little runaway, a 13-year-old runaway from New York, Morris Levy. Now, Morris Levy is one of the biggest figures in the history of American music. He, most notably, owned the word rock and roll. You don't get any better than that. He owned the word rock and roll. Of course, eventually that became reality. You can't own a word and necessarily hold captive of a word. But he did own Roulette Records, and Roulette Records had long arms. I like to think of it as a round table of original black music moguls. And of course, none of them were black, of course. Morris Levy was certainly one of them. So was Henry Stone. But the thing that's specific about Morris Levy is it's known, well documented, well established. He was connected to the mob, very connected to the mob. So his working for these hotels when he was 13 years old, goes back home in New York and comes back. He brings that mob money with him. He brings that mob mentality with him. Now, we could flip forward really to contemporary times. I think what's most notable in Miami's landscape for those of us who've been alive for the last 30, 40 years is in 1979, as Cocaine Cowboys perfectly spelled out, the cocaine wars really went public with the Dadeland Mall massacre. Once that happened, everything was on the center stage, front stage, as far as where this money was coming from and what was funding much of the area economically in all businesses. There was a trickle-down effect. So even if you kept your nose clean, you may have had involvement some way. And this, of course, was right before the Mariel boat lift. The Mariel boat lift changed the landscape racially of Miami more than anything. And for any fan of Scarface, you've seen a great dramatization of something that's a reality. And Brian De Palma did a fair job, or should we give credit to the screenwriter, but either way, which was Oliver Stone, screenwriter for Scarface. They made a good point that only about 25% or less actually brought a criminal element with them, but it certainly did. And we had to live through that, and that paints the picture of the area. And Scarface was filmed in 1983, 3 years after the boat lift, 4 years after the Dadeland massacre. What's ironic about all this, and I can't express this enough, all credit to Gary Webb, the great journalist who befriended Ricky Ross, the real Ricky Ross, when they reported to Ricky Ross in prison that Gary Webb had died. Broke his heart. That's because Gary Webb was a truth seeker, an iconoclast. This is a man who believes in reality instead of fantasy. So yes, Ricky Ross, big part of what happened. Was he the top guy? We all know that. We all know he was not. Was he the top guy to take a fall? Yes. If he was number 3 on the totem pole, what happened to number 2? What happened to number 1? These are always questions we have to ask ourselves. And for anyone who is living in a fantasy world, never be aspiring to number 3. You could fantasize about number 1 till you're dead. So you got to ask yourself who was number 1. And you got to ask yourself, why was that person number 1? And Gary Webb spelled it all out perfectly in his book, Dark Alliance. Bottom line here is this. In 1979, Jimmy Carter was president. And Jimmy Carter didn't have the same agenda. The Cold War meant less to Jimmy Carter. To Ronald Reagan, the Cold War was number 1. Because as a Republican president in office, taking down the communists is key. How do you take down communists? You keep them at bay. And with the Contra affair, with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, you've got to step your foot in there if you're going to be an imperialist government. And he stepped his foot in there. Now, eventually, Congress said you can't do that. You're using taxpayer money to step into the Cold War where we don't belong. So how do you manage that? You got to raise funds. You got to raise funds somehow. And this is certainly something I wouldn't go out on a limb and say, but Gary Webb did. And he gave his life for it. The man is no longer alive. And he proved in a way that nobody has disproved, including people who have investigated it within government. At the end of the day, Ronald Reagan opened the ports of Miami to cocaine. took a cut of that money. And nobody has been able to prove that incorrect as of yet. So we have to give credit to Gary Webb for doing that research and solidifying it. Even John Kerry did an investigation and turned up the same evidence. Now here's the funny thing about this. In 1986, the dealers fell. When I say dealers, I should say traffickers. I should say top people. Those who fantasize about Scarface are looking mid-level. We're talking about how the drug enters the country. Those with the airplanes, those with the infrastructure. But in '86, suddenly the feds crack down. Suddenly there's reports on the news. Suddenly George Bush Sr. is on the news discussing what we can do about this problem. Why is it a problem if you're funding the Contras with it? Well, the Iranian-Contra affair is a whole different affair, and a whole different source of money. So if you can pay for something a different way and still have your Say No to Drugs campaign, which we have Just Say No from Ronald Reagan and his wife, that tells you right then and there where that all happens, where it all comes from. Now here's the funny thing about it. Miami Vice is a TV show that popularized Miami, the landscape, the glamour. If you want to say there's glamour in this business, in that business, they popularized it in a very fictional, almost laughable way. But that didn't go on the air until late '85, and by '86 it was certainly a hit. It makes you wonder the connections with that one. And of course, 1986 completely ended the major trafficking in the most direct way, and now it has to become an indirect industry, which so much happens with music.